Welcome to the debate. Today we are looking at a landscape that is so ubiquitous, so fundamental to the modern experience that has become almost invisible to us. We are talking about the residential area.
Right, it's the backdrop of the American dream, and yet it's a concept we rarely stop to define or critique. We live in it.
Exactly. And for our discussion today, we're defining the residential area strictly based on land use. This is land where housing, predominates, distinct from industrial or commercial zones. Whether it's a sprawling suburb of single-family homes or a cluster of multifamily units, this is the environment we are dissecting.
And the central question, the real tension here, is whether this specific design evolution represents a triumph of accessibility and planning, or if we have inadvertently engineered a landscape of, profound isolation.
Look, I'm firmly in the camp that the modern residential development is a success story. It represents a necessary, affordable escape from the cramping and chaos of the industrial city. It created a standardized, comfortable lifestyle that was, before this, the exclusive domain of the wealthy.
And I come at it from a different angle. I believe that while the intention may have been noble, the specific design choices, I'm talking about the dead-end roads, restrictive covenants, the absolute separation of use, have created commuter towns that prioritize the automobile over the human being. We've built environments that look like communities, but function more like isolation chamber.
I see why you might frame it that way, particularly looking at it through a modern urbanist lens. But let me give you a different perspective by starting with the history. To understand the value of the residential area, you have to look at what preceded it. Before the concept of the residential development really took hold, housing was essentially a binary system.
A system of haves and have-nots.
Precisely. If you were rich, you bought a town lot, you hired an architect, and you built a bespoke mansion. It was a custom process, slow, expensive. But if you were poor, you lived in shanty towns, or you were packed into tenements built strictly for rental. There was no middle ground.
So you're arguing that the residential area was the invention of the middle ground?
It was the creation of the middle-class market. Single-family houses were almost never built on speculation, meaning, built for a future sale to a resident who hadn't been identified yet. That just didn't exist. The shift that happened particularly during the post-World War II economic expansion in places like New York and Los Angeles was a breakthrough. We saw a demand for thousands of homes.
I don't deny the demand. The post-war boom is a matter of historical record.
It was massive, and it was met by speculative building. Now, I know that term speculator has baggage. Indeed, the practitioners at the time, they hated being called property speculators. It sounded predatory, so they coined a new name, residential development. But this wasn't just a marketing spin, it was a total overhaul of the process. They took entire farms and ranches, subdivided them, and controlled every single aspect. Entitlement, grading, infrastructure, utilities.
They industrialized the neighborhood.
They did. In communities like Levittown on Long Island or Lakewood south of Los Angeles, homes were sold at rates of more than one a day. I mean, that is a logistical miracle. Mass production and the standardization of design, along with government-backed mortgages, meant that for the first time, owning a house in a new residential development was cheaper than renting a cramped apartment in the city. This was a liberation.
A liberation, sure. But I just don't buy that it was purely a liberation. I think we have to look at the result of this zoning and mass production. You describe it as a solution to cramping. But what we actually created were areas where large tracts of land have, and I'm quoting the material, no services whatever.
Well, no services refers to commercial services. That is the point of a residential zone. You don't want a factory next to your bedroom.
But think about the implication of that. In these areas, especially the rural or large tract developments on the periphery, residents must use a motor vehicle to access anything, a pint of milk, a pharmacy, a school. We tied land development strictly to transport infrastructure, rail and road, rather than allowing for organic community growth. We created a dependency.
But that dependency allowed for the separation of living and working, which is what people wanted. The residential area is a protected space. Zoning usually includes a smaller floor area ratio, or FAR, than business or industrial zoning. That is a feature, not a bug. It prioritizes living space and low density over the noise and congestion of business density.
But at what cost to the social fabric? You talk about protection, but I see fragility. These systems rely entirely on the transport infrastructure. And more than that, the design enforces a kind of social stasis through restrictive covenants.
Covenants are a tool for stability. They protect the asset.
They are a tool for rigidity. These developments are regulated by deeds that are not easily changed because they require the agreement of all property owners. And as our source material notes, many of those owners may not even live in the area. They could be investors. We have built spaces that are legally and physically difficult to evolve. We have, in effect, created isolation by design.
I think you're conflating stability with stagnation, but let's dig into that core disagreement about the function of these spaces. You seem to view the separation of commerce and housing, the very definition of the residential area, as a failure.
I view it as the creation of the commuter town. That is a specific criticism raised against these developments. They serve no purpose for the greater community other than sleeping. Unlike mixed-use developments where you have a blend of commerce and activity, residents here are forced to leave for everything. It just hollows out the concept of a town.
Again, I would frame that differently. The separation is what makes the comfortable lifestyle possible. It's not that these places lack value, it's that the value is focused on domestic life. And developers didn't just build boxes and leave. As the market matured to remain competitive, they began to compete on community amenities.
Such as?
Greenbelt parks, neighborhood pools, community entry monumentation, those big welcoming signs you see. These are significant additions. They created a self-contained environment where leisure and family life were prioritized. The developer wasn't just selling a house. They were selling a lifestyle package, kitchen appliance packages, location, pools. They were building a world.
But a pool is not a grocery store. A greenbelt is not a pharmacy. These amenities don't replace essential services, so the reliance on the automobile remains absolute. And let's look at how that infrastructure is actually laid out. The criticism is that these developments are often isolated, with only one entrance and one exit.
Which limits through traffic, making the streets quieter.
It makes travel times pointlessly lengthy. If you're trying to get somewhere, you are funneled through a single choke point. It makes it significantly harder for people to walk or cycle. If you want to go to a neighbor's house that might be physically close, their backyard might touch yours, you might have to drive a mile out and around just because of the road layout. It discourages human movement in favor of vehicular movement.
I'm not really convinced by that line of reasoning because it assumes the primary goal of a residential street is transportation efficiency for the passerby. It isn't. It's safety and tranquility for the resident. But I want to go back to the production model itself because I think you are dismissing the economic miracle that allowed this to happen.
I'm not dismissing the economics. I'm questioning the architectural legacy.
But the two are linked. The source material highlights how the large-scale practitioners transformed from property speculators to residential developers. This wasn't just a name change. It was a change in process. By controlling entitlement, grading, infrastructure, and housing all at once, they achieved efficiencies that were impossible before. They used the same techniques that made the automobile affordable, standardization and repetitive assembly tasks, to make housing affordable.
So Fordism applied to the living room.
Exactly. And that is a good thing. It democratized the home.
And that is exactly where the problem lies. Mass production resulted in a uniformity of product. You see efficiency, I see a lack of diversity.
But there was diversity. The material explicitly mentions that diverse floor plans with differing room counts and multiple elevations, different exterior looks for the same plan, appeared as the market matured. You could choose your facade.
That is a superficial diversity. Multiple elevations is just dressing up the same box in different wrapping paper. The reality is that these developments offer homes in a narrow range of age, price, size, and features.
That allows for a cohesive neighborhood character.
It allows for exclusion. It means that potential residents with different needs, wishes, or resources, perhaps the elderly, the young, or those with lower incomes, must look elsewhere. We sort a society by price point and family structure. The residential development is a filter that created a monoculture. You don't get the vibrant mix of a real town, you get a demographic slice.
Or you could say it created a community of shared interests and stability. The smooth flow of capital and advertising that facilitated this didn't just sell houses, it built the American middle class. It solved a massive demand crisis in post-war cities. You cannot overlook that before this model, the alternative was cramped city apartments or shantytowns.
That is a fair point, but we are living with the legacy of that solution now. And the legacy is physical. I want to talk about the design of the actual lots and streets, because this is where the theory of comfort really clashes with the reality of human behavior.
What specifically are you referring to?
The front nursery paradox.
I assume you mean the front gardens or lawns?
Yes. The material notes that front nurseries, or gardens, often have low walls or no walls at all, because developers wanted to reduce costs by eliminating the distinction between public and private space.
Which creates an open, welcoming atmosphere. It flows.
In theory, in practice, it creates a space of anxiety. Residents tend to these spaces to outperform their neighbors. It becomes a display case, not a living space. The source material is quite damning here. It says these places often become unused, disliked, and neglected. It's land that you own but cannot really use because it's performative. You don't sit out there, you just mow it so the neighbors don't judge you.
I think disliked and neglected might be an overstatement in many cases. People love their curb appeal. But I do see the point about the blurring of lines. However, you have to weigh that against the other design features that were introduced for safety.
Such as?
Traffic calming, the winding streets, the looped roads, the dead-end roads or cul-de-sacs. These weren't accidental. They were designed to slow down life, quite literally. A slowly winding street forces cars to decelerate. It makes the streets safer for children.
Does it? Because the counter-argument presented is that these modern roads are often packed with unattended vehicles.
That is an issue of parking management, not road design.
It is a direct result of the design. When you create a zone with no services, everyone needs a car, often 2 or 3 per household. Those cars have to go somewhere. They end up on the street. It's unsightly, it blocks pavements, and the material explicitly states it makes roads more unsafe for kids because it obstructs visibility. Plus, it becomes a source of arguments among neighbors. We design streets for cars, filled them with cars, and then wonder why they aren't safe for children.
That's an interesting point, though. I would frame it as a trade-off. The alternative, the grid system with high-speed through traffic, is certainly not safer. And I would argue that despite the cars, there is an attempt at greenery that you are ignoring.
I'm not ignoring it. I'm critiquing its execution. Everyone loves a tree-lined street. That is a universal truth. But the reality of modern residential development is often quite different.
How so?
Highway authorities and developers often discourage trees and hedgerows.
Likely for visibility and maintenance reasons. Roots and pipes, leaves on the road.
Perhaps. But the result is developments dominated by hard materials. They appear colorless. We have replaced the organic complexity of a tree-lined lane with asphalt, concrete, and maybe a small strip of grass that no one is allowed to walk on. It's a sterile environment. It's efficient to grade and pave, but it's oppressive to live in.
I think you are painting a very bleak picture of what is, for many, a very desirable place to live. These developments help form the stereotypical image of suburban America for a reason. People want to live there, and they want their investment protected. This brings me back to the covenants you mentioned earlier.
The restrictive covenants.
Yes, you view them as rigid, but they are the legal bedrock that prevents a factory from opening next door to your bedroom or a neighbor from turning their lawn into a junkyard. They regulate development patterns to maintain the character of the area.
But at what point does maintaining character become preventing adaptation?
When you buy into a residential area, you are buying a promise of stability.
But cities and communities need to breathe. They need to change. The material points out that restrictive covenants are not easily changed. It requires the agreement of all property owners. Imagine trying to get 100% agreement on anything in a neighborhood.
It is difficult, yes.
It's nearly impossible. This means that even if the needs of the community change, say they need more density or a small local shop or a daycare, the residential areas is locked in a static state. It's a fossilized version of what the developer thought was perfect in 1950 or 1980 or 2000. It cannot evolve.
But that fossilization is exactly why the property values remain high. It is the assurance that the environment will not degrade. It provides financial security for the family.
It provides financial security at the cost of social vitality.
Let's take a step back and look at the broader picture here. We are discussing the modern residential area. I maintain that this model, born largely from the post-war economic expansion, was a massive success in terms of human welfare.
Welfare in terms of shelter, perhaps?
In terms of quality of life, we moved from tenants to owners. We moved from bespoke mansions for the few to comfortable homes for the many. The standardization, the residential development rebranding, the efficiency, these were tools that solved a housing crisis. It offered a lifestyle distinct from the industrial city, protected by low FAR and zoning. It gave people their own piece of the world.
That is the compelling narrative, certainly, and I don't deny that it provided roofs over heads. But I come back to the cost of that comfort. The design legacy is one of isolation. We created spaces that do not mesh well with the greater community. We built commuter towns that act as dormitories rather than villages.
But they are safe dormitories.
Are they? When they're reliant on cars, filled with hard materials, and stripped of organic street structures like trees. The material highlights that these places can be aesthetically sterile and socially disconnected. Residents are covertly competing over front lawns they don't use, while arguing over parking spaces on winding roads that block the sidewalk. That isn't a community. That is a collection of people hiding in boxes.
And yet, looking at the history from Levittown to today, the demand persists. The residential development remains the dominant form of housing growth. People vote with their feet, and they walk, or rather drive, into these neighborhoods.
They do. And perhaps that tension between the stereotypical image of suburban America that we desire and the reality of the isolation it produces is something we will always grapple with. We want the escape, but we forget that we are escaping to a place that effectively cuts us off.
It is a complex trade-off between the efficiency of the developer model and the organic needs of a community. But the fact remains that for millions, this land use, where housing predominates, is home.
Indeed, and whether that home is a sanctuary or a silo is largely determined by those initial design choices, the roads, the zoning, and the covenants.
A fascinating look at the structures we live in. Thank you for listening to The Debate.